Good evening, and welcome to this Louisiana Civil War Roundtable. My name is Bill Arceneaux, and I'll be the moderator of tonight's roundtable discussion. We hope you have just viewed, as we have, the first segment of the critically acclaimed series, The Civil War. Louisiana Public Broadcasting thought it would be entirely appropriate to assemble a group of individuals with both professional and general interest in the Civil War. Tonight we want to focus very generally on two areas: the causes of the Civil War, which was the primary topic of this evening's segment, and the Civil War in Louisiana. Permit me to introduce to you now the members of our very distinguished panel. Dr. Gaines Foster is professor of Southern History at Louisiana State University. Gaines is a student of the New South and the history of the New South, and also Reconstruction, and he will, aside from talking about whatever he wishes to talk about, will primarily focus on the aftermath of the Civil War. Dr. Larry Hewitt of Southeastern Louisiana University, a man with a distinguished publication record in the field of the Civil War and its many battles, particularly the Battle of Port Hudson, which was of strategic importance to Louisiana and, of course, to the Confederacy. Mr. Ron Kennedy, the commander of the Louisiana Division, Sons of Confederate Veterans. Mr. Kennedy has devoted a lifetime of interest in this, in the study of the Civil War, and brings a unique perspective to this panel. Dr. Marietta Lebreton, a professor of history at Northwestern State University, a very distinguished historian of our state, of Louisiana, and of course the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And finally, Dr. Luther Stewart, a practicing physician here in Baton Rouge, a man who also has spent a great deal of time and interest in studying the Civil War. As we developed this panel, we felt that it was important to have not only professional historians, but lay people as well. And the reason why we felt this was important was because of the impact that the series from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Civil War, really had on our country. It brought the Civil War from the classroom into the living room, from the halls of colleges and universities to Main Street. It really had a profound impact on this country in many, many ways. And it reminded us of how important this titanic struggle was to us and to our future. As I think, as Shelby Foote said, everything we are today can trace its roots to the Civil War. But let's talk about what we've just seen, this highly acclaimed series. Dr. Lebreton, what are your views?
Well, Bill, I certainly think it is an outstanding media production. But as a historian, I feel that perhaps within time limits and within limits of production expense and so forth, that perhaps varied causes of the Civil War might have been brought out. For example, the protective tariff, even though a little earlier, but certainly was a dividing force between North and South. The Missouri Compromise, for example, again, another example. Nullification under President Jackson certainly turned, many of the Southerners away from his Democratic Party. And I realize there is a limitation of time and, as I said, also of production expense. And certainly I'm not denying that slavery is certainly one of the major factors leading to the Civil War. But many of these came earlier. And many of these, if you read the contemporary writings or hear the contemporary speakers, were quite important. I noticed in tonight's series they made mention of a sectional division in the Constitutional Convention. I'm sure that reference was to the 3/5 compromise. That was a North-South compromise, but that was also a big small state compromise, perhaps more so in 1787 than it was a North-South compromise. So I suppose what I'm saying is I believe there were many, many causes of the Civil War, among which was slavery, and it did become more important as you move on into the 1840s and 50s. But I still feel, had not some of these other controversies arisen earlier, perhaps as I believe it was Shelby Foote said, perhaps they could have still compromised, and they lost the possibility of compromise.
So you're saying that perhaps there was a crescendo of events
Yes.
that was leading our country almost inescapably and inevitably to war?
Well, certainly I wouldn't say necessarily in that sense. I think it possibly could have been stopped, but I do believe by the 1850s it was too late. And as this series showed tonight, in the 1850s, you have the Brooks-Sumner affair, you have the Bleeding Kansas, you have John Brown's raid at Hoppus Ferry. You begin to have the serious violent events then. But again, I believe that most of this had a much longer background than that. And as long as you had the older leaders of Calhoun and Clay and some others that seemed to be able to compromise, by the early 1850s, you're losing those leaders. You're getting instead Jeff Davis, you're getting Stephen A. Douglas, you're getting a newer, younger leadership, perhaps too inexperienced to compromise, perhaps too late to compromise.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to follow up on that?
Well,
Ron?
I think, with the expenditure of approximately $5 million, certainly it's obviously a very well put together from a technical point of view. The musical score is wonderful. We all enjoyed the music throughout, which seemed to be mostly Southern. But my concern is that it seemed to dwell upon one issue, a very myopic view of history. And again, the war for Southern independence, as I prefer to call it, it was not a civil war. It was not a contest between two factions trying to take control of the central government. The Union did not dissolve when the Southern states seceded and established themselves as an independent nation. It was still very, very viable between those states that freely of their own choosing chose to remain. And so I feel that the monies expended really did a great job showing one view, but the Southern people, the Southern heritage, was sort of slighted, and not sort of, it was in fact slighted. The move towards secession, as the film showed it starts secession, and then immediately we go into the war almost, but it doesn't say that, hey, in 1786, there was a near breaking point when the northern New England states and the northern states wanted to cede the Mississippi River to Spain. And then again in 1790 when the northern states primarily wanted to use the federal treasury to pay off northern state debts. And a treasury, I may add, that was primarily supplied by tariffs paid out of southern ports. Again, in 1814, the Federalists met at Hartford, Connecticut to a high convention in order to try to see if possibly the New England states should secede from the Union. And here in Louisiana, we all should know about the famous Massachusetts representative, I believe it was Quincy, who in Congress declared that before he would allow, or before the New England states should allow the mixed race Creoles of Louisiana to come into the Union, that the New England states would secede. So secession as a doctrine was a part of our history, and it was a given. It was something that was accepted as a legitimate thing. Government was freely entered into by the sovereign states, and it was believed even by the New England states, who first threatened secession, that a state had that right to secede. Again, this, for $5 million, I think I could have found room to explain a little bit on that term and at least give the Southern heritage and the Southern people a little bit a feeling for their heritage and why our people were willing to sacrifice such an enormous sacrifice.
Well, I agree with you that secession had been a reoccurring theme in American history since the Revolution. But, of course, this was the first time that a state did secede, was when South Carolina took that very important step.
That's true. It's the first time that a state found it necessary and that the other states refused to compromise. But, again, the right existed. And whether or not we choose to exercise the right does not invalidate the right. The right still existed.
Well, actually, the war is about two things. I don't think we can find causes, and certainly we probably within this panel can't agree on causes. But if you look at causation, you have to explain the timing and things like that. And it seems to me there are two issues that come together in the war. One is the question Ron has raised about secession. It's not an established right, it's a right in dispute. And I think many constitutional scholars and historians looking back to 1787 say, in essence, the Constitution didn't really answer that question.
Right.
So that it's not an established right, it's a right that's in contention, and in one level, that's what the war is about. But the other question is, why did the South choose to exercise that questionable right? And that, it seems to me, goes back to slavery. I have trouble with the way the first episode handles causation. I think I have more doubts about the way it handles Northern motivation than I do Southern motivation. In other words, certainly the long history of the dispute between the sections that Marietta and Ron both talked about are important in understanding this increasing sectional hostility. But when you get to the crucial decade of the 1850s, the issue of slavery in the territories. And it's an interesting question because, as Foote said, it's not, compromise failed. And I think ultimately the tariff is a very compromisable issue. You can argue whether you want to take it up 5% or 10% or down 5% or 10%. The existence of slavery isn't. And I think that's why ultimately that was not compromisable at that point. The key, I think, the problem I have with the show is Northern causation. The war did not start in the North as a war to end slavery. It became one. It's at the heart of the conflict between the sections. But the question of Northern motivation, I think, is simplified there, which makes even the second half of this episode hard to understand, with the first part talking about how the North in many ways marched off to end slavery. You don't understand why the North is so reluctant to free the slaves, to use black troops when the second half comes up. And I think that's important because the answer there is in many ways very similar to the answer in part of why the South was so determined to preserve slavery, and that's the whole issue of race in American society. And that explains why the outcome of the war, Reconstruction, in many ways happens the way it does, because the Northern commitment to equality is brief. It comes late.
Well, where does the preservation of the Union come in as a Northern cause?
I think that's the main reason the North marches off in 1861, not to end slavery at that point. And law and order. I mean, if you were a Northerner, it's an attack on the flag. Fort Sumter was fired on. It was a federal garrison, federal flag, and that becomes very much an issue of loyalty to the nation and law and order.
I'd like to say in regard to secession, I believe Shelby Foote had something when he indicated that some of the Southerners, and I would agree with him, certainly the South Carolina delegates, would not have signed the Constitution had they not felt they could get out of the Union in 1789. Also, the question of the causes, I would throw something out that is seldom touched upon, and it's been addressed here to some extent. That is a lack of ability to compromise. And I would contend that many of the politicians by the 1850s did not wish to compromise. People like Jefferson Davis, the heir of John C. Calhoun, and other Southerners, but also some Northerners, because in 1860 what happens is a major shift of political power, and the Democratic Party and the Southerners, who had so much say in the government, are going to be out of power when Lincoln comes into office. And the Republicans, many former Whigs who had, like Lincoln, been unable to win election, or Stewart, who won election but really had little say in the government, would now come in. And they, neither side wanted to compromise. Those that had power did not wish to give it up, and those who had struggled so long to gain control of the national government wanted to see their programs implemented. And I think there was a determination on both sides, really, not to compromise.
Why does that happen in 1860 and not 1856 or 1828 or the other times you've had a real change in power?
I would say because of Lincoln's election, and that was something that the politicians, I mean, truly the national leaders, or the leaders of the South in Washington, perhaps would be a better way to describe them, could bring to the attention of the Southern citizens as a whole. That Lincoln, of course, was elected as a minority president. He was not on the ballot in Louisiana.
Well, Richard Nixon was a minority president, as I recall.
Gaines, I think perhaps part of the answer to your question would be that through the Compromise of 1850, or up until the Compromise 1850, you had the old leadership that Larry was referring to. And they did compromise in 1850, and it did include, part of it included, the expansion of slavery into newer areas. But that older leadership started losing out, and a new, younger leadership, and I agree with Larry, who were not willing, or perhaps able to compromise, began to take over.
Certainly, but I think it's David Potter, maybe I'm wrong, who says that the Compromise of 1850 wasn't really a compromise, it was an armistice. In other words, the old generation managed to put off the confrontation, but ultimately they didn't solve any of the problems. Indeed, with the Fugitive Slave Act, they escalated the problems in terms of understanding Northern motivation. The Fugitive Slave Act may be the most important flashpoint in the 1850s for this increasing Northern hostility and sense of power Larry's talking about. So, I mean, I guess I have trouble with the generational notion, though, I mean, I completely agree with Larry that there are a lot of people determined to carry through their programs in power. I mean, the Republicans feel in Washington that they absolutely cannot compromise on the slavery and the territory issue anymore. And I think that's true, but that ultimately gets back to this problem of what do you do with the future of the nation over slavery.
Let me ask Dr. Stewart a question. But for slavery, would we have had a civil war, in your opinion?
Well, being an amateur, I have a little bit more freedom than these professors, and I think Ron and I can say some things and not necessarily run into a lot of criticism from esteemed colleagues. I would have to disagree with him immensely on the cause of the Civil War, and I would tend to lean a little bit more with Gaines, Professor Gaines Foster, in that in my reading of Civil War, I think that we've overlooked the racial conflict that was really involved. You have a situation where you're actually trying to make beasts and brutes out of men and human beings. And I think we overlooked this conflict in the Civil War because the Civil War was based on denying the humanity to 4 million people. And anytime you have, I think, the greatest of all evils, if you want to go back to Socrates and the Greeks, and even though they had slavery, is that you cannot reduce another human being to property. And this is exactly what the whole conflict was about, in my view. If you go back to people who were writing at the time, not necessarily historians looking back, but people who were involved in the conflict and were writing about it at the time, you find that America ignored these warnings not once, but ultimately manifold times. George Washington, I think Thomas Jefferson said, you will have to solve the issue of slavery. If you do not solve this issue of slavery will destroy the country. He said it, George Washington said it. I think Andrew Jackson tried to deal with it when they had the tariff problem in Charleston, South Carolina in 1829, 1833, where he said they're using this tariff as a means for demanding secession. Next, it will be slavery. So slavery was the central issue. It was ignored, in my view, throughout the whole process. I think this series was an attempt to move from Southern mythology into the realm of reality, but in my view, which as an amateur historian, it did not move far enough. The real issue of the Civil War was, and probably is now, the issue of the racial conflicts that exist in this country.
All right. I want to, you know, it's interesting that we can talk about the quote Civil War as a war for Southern independence and talk of racial conflict, and it's almost as if this is a Southern discussion we're having because, you know, all the evil belongs down south is the unsaid inference there. But in truth, when you look at the manner in which the northern people handled the slave question, how did they emancipate their slaves? How did they rid themselves of slavery? Was it by sudden, you know, freedom to all their slaves, or was it by a gradual method that allowed them to remove these black people from their society, sell them down south, liquidate their investment, and also clean up their society? I remind you of the law in Massachusetts passed in 1788 that declared that any Indian, mulatto, or Negro that came within the Commonwealth, and this was 2 years after their emancipation, that came within their Commonwealth would be publicly whipped after 30 days if they did not leave. So the problem that I have is that you drag the racial issue in and you try to paint the Southerners as the villains, the universal villains of American history, and that's not quite the case. There's fault enough to go around. So if we're going to talk about slavery in the South, let's talk about who went to Africa and kidnapped these black people and brought them to America and sold them for a handsome pocket, and then when they marched down to Louisiana to liberate them, the money was still jingling in their pockets, and yet they are the ones that's painted by this series as being the righteous liberators of humanity, and the Southerners are painted as if we were fighting to keep men in bondage. My great-grandfather fought for the Confederacy, and he owned no slave, neither did his uncle, who died at Shiloh. So, you know, the idea that we're going to use this racial issue, if we're going to use it, then let's talk about the entire issue, North as well as South, and you'll find that there's sin enough to go around. If we're going to punish and make a society pay, then let's tell the whole truth.
Well, I suspect all of us all of us are Southerners to some degree, and we've all have relatives that fought and died in the Civil War. But you bring up a collateral point that I think we need to touch on, and that's the economic aspects of this, because slaves were property. As you pointed out, there was a gradual emancipation in the North where either they were able, there was a market for their property, in other words, what you're saying, and that's very important. What about this economic factor? What about this issue of property and the slave? How important was this to the South?
Well, Bill, excuse me for interrupting. I would have to say to really deal with the Civil War without dealing with the slave issue is going to be to really avoid a major obstacle. And I think, as Ron has pointed out, there were sins on both sides of the Mason-Dixie line. I think when you look at the whole history of development in this country, certainly when you go back into the colonial era, you will find slavery virtually existing in all of the colonies, all of the original 13 colonies. But the point that has happened is that the North managed to eliminate slavery, especially after the American Revolution. And it's interesting that some historians say that the Civil War was the second American Revolution, where the mistake they made was not dealing with the slave issue at that time. And that is, they wanted to be free from England, yet they were still holding people in bondage, denying them humanity, and treating them as property and not as human beings. And I think that you have to maintain a perspective of that in terms of dealing with what the Civil War was actually fought about. I agree that it was on both sides, but the South was actually the group, and it was called they were called the Confederacy of Slave-Holding States, not just the Confederacy of Southern States. It was the Confederacy of Slave-Holding States. And you had to be a slave state and have slavery legalized in order to be a part of the Confederacy at that time. And it's interesting that he says that his parents never owned slaves. I have great-grandparents who were slaves. And the only thing I can tell you on an issue like that is that if you avoid the real conflict of slavery, then you're really talking about a war that is just nothing but battles, and the battles have no meaning.
So, Luther, in answer to my question, you would say, had slavery not existed in the 1860s, there would not have been a Civil War.
Correct.
I would like to combine the two issues of slavery and economics for a moment. If slavery was economically profitable in the North in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, what have you, I would contend that slavery would have continued to exist in the North. It had reached a point where it was unprofitable and it ended. I would contend that had slavery become unprofitable in the South, that the owners would have emancipated their slaves when it was costing them money, and that economics plays a major role in this issue. There wasn't enough sin to go around with New England shippers who provided the slaves for a profit to Southerners, and Southerners who made a profit off the labor of the slaves. And it is an economic issue. There was the belief by many in 1860 that slaves were incapable of nothing more than agricultural laboring. This was not, I think, has been successfully proven to be an untruth, not only by their performance in our society today, but even working in some southern industries in New Orleans in particular in 1860. And had slavery continued to exist in the North, and it had been realized that slaves could operate machinery in the factories, would Northerners have turned to more and more slaves to work in those factories? I would say they would.
But I think the inevitable point is that the original colonies were established with slave labor. Virginia, all of the colonies had slave labor, and I think that initially it would have been, Dunmore and some of the earlier governors said they could not have survived as colonists without the advantage of slave labor. It was a tremendous and horrendous institution because the mortality of the people who were victimized was extremely high. And just to give an example, and I agree that economics was a factor involved, but it was not the only factor. Because if you look at Britain ended slavery in the West Indies in 1833, and they remunerated the owners without fighting a war. Lincoln offered the Southerners the same thing, and they refused. I think it really boiled down to an issue whether or not a former slave owner would be able to tolerate as his equal someone whom he had oppressed and suppressed for 300 or 400 years.
All right, again, we're trying to drag the issue back to a racial argument. But again, how was the Irish immigrants in the sweatshops of New England treated? If you say you've got to have slavery in order to have a civil war, why did the Irish fight the English? Why did the Scottish fight the English?
You get into a definition of slavery. I think if you're working for yourself and you have the benefit of pay, you have the option of going or leaving wherever you want to. But when you deny the humanity of a person and say that that person is a beast or a brute or inhuman and is not capable of self-development or self-determination, then you've got a different issue. A person who works in a slave shop or sweatshop has a right to expect some control of his work or his wages, but a slave does not. It was endless toil.
All right, again,
let's not get into a defensive. Right. Nobody's defending slavery
and
here.
That's the point I want to make.
We don't want to defend slavery. It's indefensible.
We are not trying to defend a system. We are trying to point some factors that there were other causes of the war, more important causes, and primarily it was, in my opinion, a cultural clash, a clash that was recognized quite early, even in the House in Parliament. It was Burke said in his Conciliation to the Colonies speech during the Revolutionary War that the people of the South are much more attuned and much more aggressive about their determination for freedom and independence than those of the North. There was a difference between the two northern societies and the southern societies. It was a natural schism. And I think that the differences between the northern people and the southern people, far more than their likenesses, is what led to the war for southern independence. It wasn't a war of brother against brother. It was a war of culture against culture.
Gaines, was slavery the primary cause of the Civil War?
I'm uncomfortable with picking primary causes. I would agree with your opening question. Yes, if there hadn't been slavery, I don't see where the war would have come from. I think, again, you have to talk about the process through which it came. And I think slavery and the debate over slavery in the territories and the hostilities between the regions that grew out of that was behind the war. And I don't see any way around that. I mean, if you look at the cultures, in many ways, the amazing thing is how similar the cultures were. They used, with the difference in drawl that Ron and I both have, essentially the same language. They worshiped the same God. Evangelical Protestantism was growing in both sections. The fundamental difference is slavery and what each side made of that issue. Now, I think Luther's right in that you have to talk about not just slavery but race, because that solves one of Ron's problems, because I agree with him completely.
Well, if you include race as part of culture, then we're all in agreement.
And the other thing I want to make...
No, because what I would say is they shared the racism. In other words, I completely agree with Ron that somehow Southern white people are not inherently more racist than Northern white people. I mean, one of the things I think more than economic interests that made possible abolition in the North as rapidly as it came was the percentage of the population. In other words, you can almost trace emancipation by state by percentage of the blacks in the population. The problem was much less economic than imagining a biracial society. That's what the North had it easier because it had to imagine a biracial society with 1 or 2% of its population. South Carolina was imagining a biracial society with 50 or 52% of its population. Sure. So that race really is at the heart of that, behind even the issue of slavery. And I think to take that out of the war and the causes of the war is to remove a crucial issue. I mean, in the simplest of terms, in July of 1776, in something we still celebrate all the time, the nation said all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and property. Ultimately, the war becomes, whether it started that way or not, the war becomes over that issue, whether or not we can make that promise real in American society. And in many ways, the only way we figured out to even start that process was to kill 620,000 people in the process of doing it. But I mean, ultimately, I think that's what the war goes back to.
Let me try to move a little bit from the causes to. I was impressed by the fact that Abraham Lincoln, in his inaugural address, referred to a potential civil war, but he used it with a small c. Because if memory serves, and correct me on this, you pros here, the Civil War, as we refer to it, and as we are viewing this series, was not what the people called it in the 1860s. The South, I believe, referred to it as the War for Southern Independence. The North referred to it, I think, as the War for the Secession War, the War for Secession, and later the War of the Rebellion. When does the Civil War, as a nomenclature for this conflict, when does it come into our culture, into our life?
I know the Southern side better. In the South, the war between the states, which is what I grew up on, it only comes in the 80s and 90s as they try to take away the revolutionary import of the war. And so by the 80s and 90s, you're using war between the states and the South. Though some people even in the 1890s in the South are using the Civil War, and that certainly is true by the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I'm not sure when the
as you know, the official United States documents on the war, or the official records of the War of the Rebellion, which were printed, I think, in the 1880s. Right. So clearly, we were not talking about a civil war then.
I mean, one of the reasons the Southerners want the war between the states is they're still getting called the War of the Rebellion, and they really. I mean, it's interesting how changed now. Now we have the Lehigh Rebels, and Southerners are quite happy to be called rebels. In the 1880s and 90s, that was a terrible, terrible insult to be called a rebel, because that suggested what you had done was illegal and treasonous.
It's interesting, even at the time of the celebration of the centennial in the 1960s, there was a fair amount of controversy raised by several of the Southern senators and representatives wanting the term War for Southern Independence, or at least the compromise term War between the states. Yet the North, still being in the numerical majority, managed to put us in our place, and its Civil War became official.
Well, let's turn a little bit now to the Civil War in Louisiana, and you can't really talk about the Civil War in Louisiana without focusing in on the Battle of Port Hudson, which was, I guess, the biggest in terms of the size of the battle and its strategic importance that took place within the borders of our state. Perhaps not, Larry. What do you agree with that?
I would argue not. I would say the fall of New Orleans. A book has been written about that, which was I think inappropriately, but in any case entitled "The Night the War Was Lost." And I think it is a matter that is overlooked, that the diplomatic impact that the loss of New Orleans had on the chances.
Well, I didn't. What I said was the most important battle. That was not a battle that lost New Orleans.
Well, the Southerners, there was a naval battle.
Very minor one. A very minor
Bill, and I stand corrected then. From that standpoint, I would contend that Port Hudson was the most important land engagement. Right. For terms of its impact, immediate and direct impact upon the war in Louisiana.
I'd like to hear more about this theory about the night the war was lost and the loss of the Queen City of the South at that time.
Well, New Orleans falls in April of 1862. The war's just ending its first year. And because of the European heritage of the city, the foreign diplomats who resided in New Orleans was the only true city in the South, larger than the next 5 cities combined, the only true commercial center, its largest port, that the South would lose it, and almost without putting up much of a fight, shocked a lot of people in Europe, and I think caused enough hesitation on the part of European politicians to postpone or at least take a few steps back from their position in favor of recognizing the Confederacy. And admittedly, all of them did not in Europe, but there was a big push for it. And the loss of New Orleans was enough to move that back until, again, a second loss by Robert E. Lee's army at Sharpsburg, Maryland in September of '62, followed by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. I think it was enough to finish it off. But the loss of New Orleans, even though there was no shots fired between the opposing military forces at the city itself, was of tremendous significance. The second major campaign in Louisiana was Port Hudson. Port Hudson is finally coming into its own light, and I think it's significant for a lot of reasons. And I should urge everyone to go up and visit the Port Hudson State Commemorative Area, which was recently opened, the museum there. But it was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. It was, if you will, Louisiana's glory. For the viewers who have seen the recent Hollywood release of the movie Glory, black soldiers fighting in the regular United States Army participated in an assault for the first time at Port Hudson 2 months before the engagement depicted in the movie Glory took place at Battery Wagner, South Carolina. But it was not fortunate enough to be selected by Hollywood to be made famous there.
Good point.
It was the longest true siege in all of American military history. One of the myths people have is that they ate rats at Vicksburg, which cannot be documented. They did at Port Hudson. And rats were better than mule meat, which they also ate at Port Hudson.
Did they fix them in any particular way?
That I don't know.
Since they were from Louisiana, perhaps we had a special sauce.
I literally think they roasted mules as much as you would cook an entire cow.
I would like to ask Professor Hewitt. It seems that the North really extended its major victories through naval action. In other words, the South Carolina Sea Islands, and certainly New Orleans. I think even Paducah and some of the forts in Kentucky.
Nashville, Tennessee was taken down. Tennessee River.
Yes, but I think the initial battles that the North was winning was really backed up by naval force. They would land a skirmish, and that was my impression. But I never, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask the experts if that would more or less coincide, because initially their battles were backed with some type of naval support, and then they had it off and on throughout the war. But it did seem like initially New Orleans fell by naval, and I think that some of the South Carolina Sea Islands and they were always supported by the Navy.
New Orleans. I would say you're a very perceptive amateur, Dr. Stewart. There is a small but growing school of thought among Civil War historians that, in a sense, the Confederacy never had a chance because of the Union naval superiority, particularly on the western rivers. Not so much in what they enabled the Union armies to accomplish, but after the Union Army had gained the territory, the navies alone virtually prevented the Confederates from making any serious inroads back into those areas.
Vicksburg.
I'd like to ask Dr. Hewitt a question. You spoke of the Louisiana Native Guards, which served so admirably at Port Hudson. Is there any relationship with that unit, the U.S. Native Guards, the black troops, and the CS Native Guards?
One and the same for the most part.
You mean there were black soldiers that were preparing to fight for the Confederacy?
It's the 1st Louisiana Native Guards has, as far as I know, a unique history. It was a regular militia unit in the Louisiana militia before the war. It was composed of free blacks of New Orleans, many of them wealthy, well-educated, including not only the company officers, but even the field officers. They drilled with the Louisiana militia. They were transferred to the Confederate Army. When the Confederate Army evacuated New Orleans, they went to Camp Moore. They had never been issued guns, and the decision was finally made in May of 1862 at Camp Moore that the Southern people just could not tolerate seeing guns in the hands of blacks, whatever their former status was. And so the unit went back to New Orleans and offered their services to General Benjamin Butler, who was depicted in the show this evening. And so they were not, this first group of black soldiers were not former slaves. But the 3rd Louisiana Native Guards, which also participated in the assault at Port Hudson, was composed of former slaves. But it's a very unique regiment from that standpoint.
I understand that all the NCOs, I've been told, and that's why I wanted to ask a pro on this, the Louisiana Native Guards U.S. Had been trained by the Confederate states during the militia era, or the large percentage, possibly not all of them. But it's interesting.
No, this unit went in as a unit. Privates, NCOs, company officers, and even the field officers went into the Union Army.
The unit that fought with General Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans.
They're descendants indeed.
I think they were the same unit that fought with Battle of New Orleans. So they had gone back to the
They actually had lost their social status since the Battle of New Orleans. Because of the Northern agitation over the issue of slavery, their rights had been curtailed more and more until it was not deemed appropriate to arm them.
If Port Hudson was the most important battle, land battle, between opposing armies in Louisiana, and it was a Confederate defeat, you're going to tell me it was a
surrender?
No.
Confederate surrender, or you mean?
No,
you mean we won the Battle of Port Hudson? The Confederacy won the Battle of Port Hudson?
Well, several earlier historians have contended that. I did not in my book, but a former graduate of LSU who taught at Tulane did a book on Port Hudson. Sometimes if a small force, and think of it in this terms, 7,000 Confederates tied up 40,000 Union soldiers for 49 days. Now, if you keep those soldiers from going somewhere else and accomplishing something, even though you lose your entire garrison, you might indeed achieve a victory.
Granted that, but let's look at the ultimate outcome of the Battle of Port Hudson. The ultimate outcome resulted in a Union victory.
Correct.
Fine.
In the sense the garrison surrendered.
Correct. That's right. Very strict here. Strict interpretation. But let's turn now to the greatest, in terms of at least land battles between opposing armies, the greatest victory for the Confederacy in Louisiana, and that would have to be the Red River Campaign. And Marietta, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened in the Red River Campaign?
Well, Bill, I think the statement you made is correct, but I'd like to say one thing also about the fall of New Orleans. It started a divided Louisiana, and I think that was extremely important when the Federals took control of part of the state of Louisiana, and the Confederate government sort of more or less began to govern from wheels, moving across the state, and kept moving and moving until finally it ended in Shreveport during the...
I believe it went from New Orleans to Baton Rouge to Opelousas to Shreveport.
To Shreveport. So, and I don't think in this state a lot of people realize you had that two governments operating at the same time. You had Confederate Louisiana, you had federal control Louisiana. Certainly I know Gaines knows the effect that had on Reconstruction when Reconstruction started so early in this state. But the last campaign, the Red River Campaign, of course, came in 1864, and I think it was an attempt by the Federals to not only take the Red River area, I feel, in particular to take the cotton sources of the Red River area, and also to get into Texas, and to also, finally conquer Texas. I believe there's more to be said about that cotton aspect of that Red River campaign for many reasons, but one reason is I think people forget that, and this is something tonight too I noticed, people forget that by 1864 Abraham Lincoln was not a shoo-in for re-election. In fact, if anything, it was probably thought just the opposite. And certainly those New England textile owners who perhaps had felt so strongly about slavery also felt strongly about their prosperity with the need for cotton. And therefore, I think there's a lot to be said about that Red River was just full of cotton bales just lined up along it. And either Confederates or Federals destroyed it, either way. Both destroyed it, so they would not be seized. I do think that the Battle of Mansfield certainly preserved at least one Confederate army west of the Mississippi River. It was so late, I don't know that it affected the outcome of the war itself. I do think also something pertinent to what we've been speaking of today is the racial complexity of part of that Red River area, in particular the area around the Natchitoches region, and the fact that in the antebellum period, many of the black planters in that area were very prosperous. They owned slaves themselves, which I always find when people talk about slavery is black on white. It is not necessarily black on white. It can be black and black, white and white, black and Indian, Indian and white or whatever. But up in that Cane River area, there were many blacks who suffered losses and disaster and death, destruction, just like the whites did in that river area, and who never came back from it. I mean, who were very prosperous planters prior to that river campaign, and but like I say, suffered just as did their white neighbors during that period of time. It's an unusual area, I will admit, that Cane River country, but it is, again, an example that it's hard to generalize. In fact, it's impossible to generalize.
The human suffering resulting from the war knew no class distinction, knew no racial distinction, rich or poor. They all ended up the equality of poverty, and a lot of us have stayed in that situation. But the entire Red River campaign, David Edmonds did a great job putting out the conduct of the federal troops, and from official Confederate records, sworn affidavits of the horror that the civilian population, and the thing that is so amazing is the invader of a foreign country. The invader is always in a bad position because he knows not who is his friend or foe, and he treats everyone as the foe. And the southern people, black and white, were treated to the horrors of war. And this is something that's a part of our heritage. We, as Southerners, we should be proud that, yes, we rose above the horrors of war and were able to overcome it. But the conduct of the federal troops is something that has been unparalleled, and I love to contrast that with the way that the Southern troops conducted themselves as they entered Pennsylvania. Quite a different means of treating civilian population, and quite a different attitude towards the international laws of war and the treatment of POWs and civilians.
Well, I've been to southern Pennsylvania, and there's.
I don't know what he's getting at, but I'll have to make a couple of comments on two things. One is the Red River campaign. In Louisiana, you had severe, what they call black codes, which meant that before a planter or a slave owner could manumit or emancipate slaves, there were certain requirements that that person had to undergo. And there were laws on the books that prevented free blacks from associating with slave blacks. I mean, if you were a slave owner, if you were black and a slave owner, you wanted to omit or manumit your black slaves, that slave had to be 25 years of age, had to be able to have an occupation of self-sufficiency, and it had to be approved by other planters, because no one was going to manumit slaves on one plantation and the next plantation maintain them, because you were inviting servile insurrection, as it was called at that time. So no, those black planters were not allowed to manumit their black slaves.
Let me, Gaines, what's the most enduring, we're beginning to wind down our panel discussion. What's the most enduring legacy of the Civil War?
Well, I think it's still the problem that the war was about in many ways. The show, the Civil War series, I think is excellent on the human experience of the war. That's our first memory is human suffering, which is not to be minimized, though the key. I think that might be another place for Ron to talk about both sides being guilty of that. But I think the legacy is that we remember those sorts of things about it, and we don't completely deal with the issues. And so I think the racial problem of making the Declaration of Independence real that was at the heart of the war is still the problem today. The war didn't solve that, in part because both white sides, didn't address the issue as they should have or could have then, and we still wrestle with it now.
Some people feel that the battles have ended, but the war is still going on.
Anybody would like to make a closing comment before we say goodnight?
I would like to say that again, that the people of the South have experienced having been right constitutionally, in my opinion, and yet being forced to accept a government that they did not want and fought against. And yet we have, since the, quote, war for Southern independence, have been very loyal to this country. We've been very patriotic to this country, and I feel that we certainly have done our share as Southerners.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the panelists. I thought we had a very stimulating conversation tonight. Excellent panel. The Civil War will be on every night for the remainder of this week. And on behalf of Louisiana Public Broadcasting, thank you for being with us.